I'm Graham Tong, an associate partner and licensed conveyancer in the residential conveyancing team in Canterbury. I've worked in conveyancing for law firms since 2012 and I've been at Boys & Morn for just over 8 years. I'm going to talk about the steps clients can take to prepare for sales and purchases so that they can put themselves in the best position for a quicker and smoother transaction. Firstly, it's advisable for buyers or sellers to instruct a law firm to act for them as soon as possible. Usually just after an offer has been accepted on a property, but it can be earlier, particularly for a sale. Whether you're selling or buying, an important step is to ensure you have satisfactory ID to hand. It's essential for all conveyancing firms to identify their clients at the start of a transaction. Boys & Morn use an app to assist with the ID checking process, which clients are invited to download at an early stage. Each individual client that uses the app will need to upload one form of photo ID, such as a passport or driving licence, and usually 2 forms of address ID, such as bank statements, council tax bills or utility bills. For those who can't use an app, the conveyancer will need to take certified copies of the client's original ID and carry out an electronic ID check. In short, it's important to be able to provide adequate ID straight away, because the conveyancer won't be able to proceed without ID checks being completed. At the same time as providing ID, clients will be asked to complete several forms. There's an increasing emphasis on law firms to know their clients, which usually involves them completing forms with personal details and information about their specific sale or purchase. This is a really important exercise because it gives the conveyancer details so they can quickly contact clients by phone or email, and it ensures they have key information about the property that's being sold or bought. Unfortunately, it will seem like a bit of a slog to answer all those questions, but replying in full gives the conveyancer useful insight, and in many cases it will help them to carry out administrative tasks quickly later in the process. The time a client puts into completing the forms accurately and ticking off all the tasks will help the sale or purchase to progress when the conveyancer receives the memorandum of sale from the estate agents. Another important aspect is that conveyancing firms incur expenses by paying third parties for services at an early stage. This includes ordering searches on purchases and land registry documents for sales. To cover those costs, firms request an upfront payment, so sellers and buyers should ensure they take note of the payment request in the initial letter from the conveyancer. Failing to pay funds on account is a very common oversight that can cause delays. So if a seller or buyer wants to move things quickly from the outset, they need to make sure they can send funds straight away. So far I've spoken generally about the early steps involved for a sale and purchase. Now I'm going to focus on how to get ahead in the sale process specifically, then I'll turn my attention to purchases. When a seller instructs a conveyancer, or even before that, it's crucial to consider what works have been carried out to the property, if any. If a seller has kept a folder from when they bought the property, it might contain useful documents. Also, a seller should consider what works have been completed during their ownership. Planning approvals are usually helpful, especially for works that have been carried out in the past 10 years. Extensions, loft conversions, new windows or external doors, and electrical installations are some of the most common works which will require building regulation certificates. Check for gas safety inspection records if you have a gas boiler or fire. Party wall agreements, guarantees and electrical condition reports should also be passed on to the conveyancer as soon as possible. Providing those documents at the outset can significantly reduce the number of legal questions that need to be raised by a buyer's conveyancer when they review all the paperwork for the property. Gathering all the relevant paperwork will also help a seller to complete the standard forms that sellers provide for a property. They're known in conveyancing as the protocol forms. These are the property information form and fittings and contents form for a freehold sale, and the leasehold information form is also completed for a leasehold property. These documents are crucial to the buyer's conveyancer's due diligence process, so I'd strongly recommend taking the time to complete them fully without leaving any gaps. The Law Society has a very useful guide that summarises every question in the property information form. In my opinion, it's not used enough because it can really help to simplify and explain the trickiest questions in the form. If a seller is struggling with the form, they should ask their conveyancer for a copy of that guide. Completing the property information form in full at the outset, without leaving any gaps, and supplying the required supporting documents can significantly reduce the number of questions that need to be raised by the buyer's solicitor. A seller might be very keen to send the forms to their conveyancer without delay, rushing things through, but taking the time to complete the forms properly and provide the relevant supporting documents can be key to reducing the timescale for the sale to complete. If a seller knows that there's an issue with the property, it's worth telling the conveyancer straight away. Examples include missing building regulations sign-offs, lack of right of way, or a dispute with a neighbour. For a leasehold property, a seller might have altered the property without the necessary landlord's consent. Such issues are likely to be picked up by the buyer's conveyancer, so possible strategies to deal with them can be discussed with the seller's conveyancer early in the process to help avoid delays later on. One mandatory aspect of most sales is to ensure an energy performance certificate, which is known as an EPC, is available for a buyer to review. Anyone can check the EPC register online and it's free to use. If an EPC is not available or has expired, a new one will be required, so it's worth checking before a sale commences. The estate agents will usually be able to arrange the EPC for a seller. It's worth noting that listed buildings are an exception to the requirement for an EPC. Finally, on the subject of sales, I should touch on leasehold property. A seller should ideally try to provide their conveyancer with the past 3 years' service charge accounts, the most recent ground rent invoice and receipt for payment, and the building's insurance policy schedule. One of the best ways to get ahead with a leasehold sale is to ask the management company or managing agent to confirm their fees and requirements to provide a management pack, which will usually be required because they give lots of useful information to the buyer and their conveyancer about the management of the building, as well as post-completion information. The seller will almost certainly need to pay an administration fee, which is usually several £100s, and it's important to order the pack early because it can take weeks to be released. Now moving on to purchasing a property. It may sound obvious, but buyers should double check their finances at an early stage, ensuring they have sufficient money to buy the property, including all the extra costs. A buyer needs to factor in all the relevant costs, including stamp duty, land registry fees and conveyances fees. For leasehold purchases or freehold purchases on managed estates, this could include post-completion fees of many hundreds of pounds, or occasionally more than £1,000. Linked to this, buyers will need to provide source of funds information at the outset, as it's a key part of a conveyancer's due diligence. Compliance with anti-money laundering regulations has become a hot topic for conveyancers in recent years, and the information they need to obtain seems to increase year after year. Buyers should be prepared to provide evidence in the form of a minimum of 6 months' bank statements, if savings are the source of funds. Conveyancers may need to delve further into the financing, so buyers need to be ready and willing to provide whatever information is requested. This might include, for example, evidence of an inheritance or sale of property or another asset. Another key point for buyers to decide early is whether they'll have a survey. Some clients seem to believe a survey is a needless optional extra when buying a property. Personally, I couldn't disagree more. I always advise clients that surveys are as important as the legal work. Buying property is obviously very expensive, and resolving problems with the condition of a property after completion can be very costly. For example, issues such as damp or subsidence can cost thousands to rectify. I've known surveys to reveal major issues that cause clients to withdraw from a purchase. If issues are discovered, it can be a strong factor to enable a buyer to negotiate the purchase price. A survey could reveal that a buyer is paying significantly more than market value for the property. Leaving a survey too late in the conveyancing process can irritate sellers and make it less likely for them to renegotiate if an issue is found. Overall, my strong advice is to arrange a survey as soon as possible so that it aligns with the conveyancing searches and legal inquiries. Buyers who are relying on a mortgage to fund their purchase should arrange that mortgage as soon as possible with their chosen lender. It will usually take a few weeks at least to obtain a mortgage offer, so it's not something to be left until the last minute. A buyer might find that they cannot borrow as much money as they expected, or the lender's surveyor might downvalue the property, which isn't an issue most buyers want to be dealing with late in a process. Finally, on the specific subject of purchases, it can be useful for a buyer to raise any questions from their own inspection of the property with their conveyancer at an early stage. The questions can be passed on to the seller's solicitor for the seller to answer, and they might cover things that the buyer's conveyancer won't be able to see in the legal paperwork. Hopefully there we've covered most of the key points, but also have a few general words of advice for sellers and buyers regarding expectations. One of the most common questions I have to answer is how long a sale or purchase will take. From experience, I can say that there's no easy answer to that question, especially at an early stage. Typically, conveyancing takes several months, even for sales or purchases that seem like they should be straightforward. So I'd advise leaving plenty of time for the process to unravel. Instructing a conveyancer through a transaction where you only have 4 weeks to complete ahead of a crucial deadline will almost certainly end in disappointment. Sellers and buyers can help themselves by preparing mentally for the process to take time, especially for leasehold sales and purchases, when there's much more scope for delays with third parties like managing agents. Going into the process with a realistic expectation of the timescale and realising that one party cannot unilaterally control that timescale will help you to navigate a process that can be stressful and frustrating, but usually ends with the satisfying outcome of completing the sale or purchase. While it's an important point that one party cannot control the timescale, I hope I've also made clear that there are plenty of ways in which a seller or buyer can assist with speeding up the process. Sellers and buyers being well prepared at the outset will give the best chance of a quick turnaround time, and I hope this brief guide helps you with that preparation.